Everyone knows an iceberg sank the Titanic, right? Wrong. Analysis of the wreckage reveals only 6 narrow gashes, not a massive breach. What if I told you that thumb-sized wrought iron rivets were actually the real culprits? Engineers who examined the wreckage found something shocking. These rivets contain slag levels 3 times higher than modern limits, making them dangerously brittle in cold water. Scientific tests at -1 degree Celsius showed these rivets shattered like glass under pressure, while modern steel simply bends. When the iceberg hit, these rivets didn't just deform, they broke apart completely, allowing the hull plates to separate. Would the Titanic have survived if these tiny fasteners had been made properly? The truth about this famous disaster goes much deeper than you might think. The Iceberg Myth. Let's dig deeper into what really happened that fateful night. You've seen the movie. You've heard the stories. But what if I told you the iceberg wasn't the real villain in this tragedy? For over a century, we've accepted a simple explanation. The Titanic hit an iceberg and sank. It's the story we tell our children. It's the tale portrayed in movies. It's become shorthand for any disaster that seems obvious and unavoidable. But this explanation ignores a crucial fact. Ships in the North Atlantic regularly encountered icebergs without sinking. In the early 1900s, hitting an iceberg wasn't that unusual for ships crossing the Atlantic. Most vessels survived these encounters with only minor damage. The SS Arizona hit an iceberg in 1879, and despite serious damage to its bow, stayed afloat and reached harbor safely. Similarly, the SS Kronprinz Wilhelm struck an iceberg in 1907, but made it to port with just a dented bow. These weren't small ships, either. They were major ocean liners carrying hundreds of passengers. So, what made the Titanic different? Why did this supposedly unsinkable ship go down when others survived? The Titanic wasn't just any ship. Its designers built it specifically to withstand collisions. The hull featured a double bottom and 16 watertight compartments separated by massive bulkheads. These safety features weren't just for show. They represented the most advanced maritime safety technology of the time. The ship's builders and White Star Line executives proudly declared that even if the first 4 compartments flooded completely, the Titanic would remain afloat. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, calculated that the Titanic could stay afloat with up to 4 of its forward compartments completely flooded. This wasn't guesswork. It was solid engineering based on displacement calculations and the ship's overall buoyancy. The Titanic was literally designed to survive a head-on collision with an iceberg. Yet somehow, a glancing blow along the starboard side caused catastrophic damage that sank the ship in just 2 hours and 40 minutes. This is where the story gets interesting. When the iceberg scraped along the Titanic side, it didn't tear a giant hole in the hull, as many people imagine. Modern sonar mapping of the wreckage has revealed only 6 thin tears, totaling just 1 square meter of damage, not the massive 300-foot gash often depicted in illustrations. With such limited damage, the flooding should have been contained by the watertight compartments. According to survivors' accounts and later investigations, the damage wasn't a single massive breach, but rather multiple small openings. So, if the damage was relatively limited, and the ship was designed to handle flooding in multiple compartments, why did it sink so quickly? The surprising answer lies in 3 critical flaws that turned what should have been a manageable accident into history's most famous maritime disaster. The first problem was the material quality of the rivets holding the hull plates together. The second was the ship's excessive speed despite numerous ice warnings. The third was an overlooked design compromise in the watertight bulkheads. Together, these 3 factors created a perfect storm of failure that doomed the Titanic and its passengers. Think about it. If icebergs regularly struck ships without sinking them, and if the Titanic was specifically engineered to withstand such impacts, something else must have gone catastrophically wrong. The truth is that the iceberg wasn't some unstoppable force of nature that no ship could have survived. It was the trigger that exposed multiple hidden weaknesses in the Titanic's construction and operation. When we examine shipwrecks from the early 20th century, we find numerous examples of vessels surviving damage that was, on paper, far worse than what the Titanic experienced. The SS Subic ran aground in 1907 and had its entire bow torn off, yet the watertight bulkheads held and not a single passenger died. The RMS Republic collided with another ship in 1909 and stayed afloat for over 38 hours before finally sinking, giving plenty of time for all passengers to be rescued. Why couldn't the Titanic, larger, newer, and supposedly safer than these other ships, survive its encounter with an iceberg? The conventional narrative gives us no satisfying answer to this question. This is where our investigation gets particularly interesting. The real story of the Titanic disaster isn't about an unavoidable collision with an iceberg. It's about how three critical flaws work together to transform a survivable accident into an unprecedented catastrophe. These weren't obvious flaws. They were hidden in plain sight, masked by the ship's impressive size and luxury. The first and most surprising of these flaws involves tiny metal fasteners that most passengers never saw or thought about. These small components, each about the size of your thumb, played an outsized role in the disaster. When metallurgists examined rivets recovered from the Titanic wreckage, they discovered something alarming about the composition of these crucial fasteners. Let's look at these tiny pieces of metal that were supposed to hold the unsinkable ship together. What made them fail so catastrophically when the iceberg scraped along the hull? The answer lies in these seemingly insignificant components that ultimately determine the fate of over 1,500 souls. Tiny failures, massive consequences. The tiny metal fasteners that held the unsinkable ship together tell a surprising story of engineering failure. What if I told you that objects smaller than your thumb doomed over 1,500 people to a watery grave? I'm talking about rivets, those small metal fasteners that held the Titanic's massive hull plates together. These tiny metal cylinders might seem insignificant when you think about a ship that weighed over 52,000 tons. But these small components played an enormous role in the disaster. Rivets are basically metal pins that connect steel plates. They create watertight seals that keep ocean water outside where it belongs. On a ship like the Titanic, these connections needed to be incredibly strong. Each steel plate in the hull experienced enormous pressure from the water pushing against it. The rivets formed the critical links in this chain of strength. Think about it this way. Imagine building a bathtub from metal plates. You could have the strongest plates in the world, but if the connections between them are weak, water will find its way through. Now, multiply that bathtub to the size of a 9-story building that's nearly 3 football fields long. That was the Titanic, and it needed approximately 3 million rivets to hold it all together. The hot riveting process used to build the Titanic involved heating rivets until they glowed red hot, positioning them in pre-drilled holes where hull plates overlapped, and hammering them flat to create a secure, watertight seal when cooled. But here's where things get interesting. Not all rivets on the Titanic were the same. In areas where machines could reach, the builders used stronger steel rivets. But in harder-to-reach areas like the bow and stern, they used wrought iron rivets instead. These wrought iron rivets were more suitable for manual installation in tight spaces where riveting machines couldn't fit. The problem wasn't that they used wrought iron rivets. Many ships used them successfully. The problem was the quality of these particular rivets. Modern scientists have examined rivets recovered from the Titanic wreckage, and what they found was alarming. The wrought iron in these rivets contained approximately 9% slag, 3 times the 2 to 3% permitted by modern standards. Slag is a glassy byproduct from the metal smelting process. Small amounts of slag are normal in wrought iron, but excessive amounts create weak points in the metal structure. Think of it like making chocolate chip cookies. A few chocolate chips make for a good cookie, but if you put in way too many chocolate chips, the cookie falls apart because there's not enough dough holding it together. In the Titanic's rivets, there was too much slag and not enough good iron holding everything together. Why would the builders of the most advanced ship in the world use substandard rivets? The answer likely involves money and production pressure. The White Star Line was in a hurry to complete the Titanic and its sister ships. They needed millions of rivets quickly, and quality may have been sacrificed for speed and cost. When the Titanic struck the iceberg in the freezing North Atlantic, these slag-filled rivets faced their ultimate test. The temperature of the water was about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius, just below freezing. This extreme cold made the already weak rivets even more brittle. What happened next was a catastrophic chain reaction. As the iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship, it didn't create one giant hole as many people imagine. Instead, it caused the hull plates to flex inward slightly. This put enormous strain on the rivets, holding these plates together. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, later conducted tests on rivets similar to those used on the Titanic. Their findings were shocking. At temperatures matching the North Atlantic that night, these brittle rivets popped their heads off at just 4,000 kilograms of load, less than half the 9,000 kilograms they should have withstood. Under normal circumstances, good quality rivets might have deformed slightly but held the plates together. But the Titanic's brittle, slag-filled rivets couldn't handle the stress. They shattered like glass, allowing the hull plates to separate just enough for water to pour in. Imagine a zipper slowly opening along the side of the ship. As each rivet failed, more strain transferred to the neighboring rivets, causing them to fail too. This created a series of relatively small openings along approximately 300 feet of the hull below the waterline, enough to flood 6 compartments. The failure of these tiny metal fasteners played a crucial role in transforming what might have been a manageable accident into an unstoppable disaster. If the rivets had held, the damage might have been limited to just a few compartments, and the Titanic might have limped to port with all passengers safe. This catastrophic material failure reveals a critical vulnerability in what was supposed to be the world's safest ship. The Titanic wasn't just defeated by an iceberg, it was betrayed by its own building materials. The science behind this failure goes beyond simple engineering mistakes and reveals a fascinating story about how materials behave under extreme conditions. The science of failure. To understand why the Titanic sank so quickly, we need to examine how materials behave under stress and extreme conditions. Imagine building the world's most advanced ship, but using metal fasteners that turn as fragile as glass in cold water. That's exactly what happened with the Titanic. The tiny rivets holding the massive hull plates together had a serious flaw that would only reveal itself in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. Let's talk about material brittleness for a moment. Most metals change their properties when temperature drops. You can try a simple experiment at home. Take a rubber band and put it in your freezer for an hour. When you take it out, instead of stretching, it will snap when you try to bend it. Something similar happens with metal, especially certain types of metal with impurities. The Titanic's builders faced a choice when selecting rivets for the hull. Steel rivets were stronger and more resistant to cold temperatures, but they were also more expensive and harder to work with. Wrought iron rivets were cheaper and easier for manual installation, especially in the curved sections of the bow and stern where riveting machines couldn't reach. Facing pressure to keep costs down and speed up construction, White Star Line chose the cheaper option for many sections of the ship. This decision might have been fine if the wrought iron rivets had been high quality, but metallurgists who examined rivets recovered from the Titanic wreckage found something troubling. The chemical composition of these rivets revealed they contained nearly 3 times the acceptable amount of slag. What exactly is slag? It's essentially the impurities that form during the metal-making process. Think of it like the foam that rises to the top when you boil pasta, except in this case, it's impurities in the metal. A small amount of slag is normal in wrought iron, but excessive amounts create weaknesses in the metal structure. Under normal conditions, a good quality rivet should bend before it breaks. The technical term for this is ductility, the ability of a metal to deform under stress without breaking. But the high slag content in the Titanic's rivets significantly reduced their ductility, especially in cold temperatures. When we look at the chemical makeup of proper rivets versus the Titanic substandard ones, the difference is clear. Good quality wrought iron should have slag content below 2%, with slag evenly distributed throughout the metal. The Titanic's rivets had slag content up to 9% in some samples, and this slag wasn't evenly distributed. Instead, it formed long, thin inclusions that created weak points throughout the metal. Temperature makes a huge difference in how metals behave. Most metals have what scientists call a ductile to brittle transition temperature. Above this temperature, metals bend before breaking. Below it, they snap like glass. For the Titanic's rivet iron, this transition temperature was much higher than it should have been because of the excess slag. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, the water temperature was about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, the high slag rivets became extremely brittle. Modern tests have recreated these conditions to show exactly what happened that night. Scientists performed what's called a Charpy test on samples similar to the Titanic's rivets. In this test, a swinging pendulum strikes a small sample of metal. When they tested modern high-quality steel at minus 1 degree Celsius, the pendulum hit the sample with a thud and stopped, showing the metal absorbed the energy by bending. But when they tested metals similar to the Titanic's at the same temperature, the pendulum hit with a sharp ping sound and barely slowed down. The sample broke into pieces that flew across the room. This dramatic difference shows how brittle the Titanic's materials became in the cold water. The failure mechanism during the collision was straightforward but catastrophic. When the iceberg scraped against the hull, it applied pressure to the steel plates. In a properly built ship, the rivets would have deformed slightly but held the plates together. But the Titanic's brittle rivets couldn't handle the stress. Instead of bending, they shattered. As the rivet heads popped off, the hull plates began to separate. Water pressure did the rest, forcing the plates further apart and allowing more water to rush in. This created a domino effect. As more water entered, more pressure was applied to neighboring rivets, causing more failures along the seams. The high sulfur content in the steel hull plates made matters worse. Sulfur combines with magnesium to form what metallurgists call stringers, microscopic lines of weakness that act like highways for cracks to travel along. These stringers, combined with the brittle rivets, created the perfect conditions for catastrophic failure. Modern analysis has shown that if the rivets had been properly made with less slag, they likely would have deformed rather than shattered. This would have limited the damage to a much smaller area, potentially allowing the ship to stay afloat until help arrived. But there's another critical factor that made this material failure so deadly: the speed at which the Titanic was traveling. At 22 knots, the Titanic wasn't even the fastest liner of its day. The Lusitania could reach 26 knots, but it was moving dangerously fast for the conditions. The physics of collision are unforgiving. Impact energy increases with the square of velocity. This means that at 22 knots, the collision force was more than 4 times greater than it would have been at just 10 knots. A slower speed might have given those brittle rivets a fighting chance to hold. This excessive speed through dangerous waters would prove to be the second critical mistake in the chain of failures that doomed the Titanic. The question remains: why was the ship moving so fast when danger lurked in those frigid waters? Racing through a minefield. The captain's decision to maintain full speed through dangerous waters reveals a shocking disregard for safety protocols that would have devastating consequences. The Titanic was speeding at 22 knots through an ice field. But why was this so dangerous? While brittle rivets created the conditions for failure, the ship's excessive speed turned a potential problem into a certain disaster. This brings us to the second critical flaw in the Titanic disaster: the decision to maintain high speed despite multiple ice warnings. On April 14, 1912, the day of the collision, the Titanic's wireless operators received at least 7 messages from other ships warning about icebergs and ice fields directly in the ship's path. The first warning came that morning from the SS Caronia, reporting bergs, growlers, and field ice ahead. Throughout the day, more warnings arrived. The Baltic reported icebergs and large quantities of field ice. The America warned of large icebergs in the exact area where the Titanic would later hit. The Californians sent a message saying they were stopped and surrounded by ice. The most concerning message came from Mesaba, which warned of a massive ice field directly in the Titanic's path, with icebergs rising 200 feet above the water. Despite all these warnings, Captain Smith made a decision that has puzzled maritime experts for over a century. He maintained the Titanic's speed at 22 knots. That's about 25 miles per hour, which might not sound fast compared to cars, but for a ship the size of the Titanic, in an area known to contain icebergs, it was dangerously high. If we look at a map of the North Atlantic shipping lanes, we can see that the Titanic was following the southernmost route, which was standard for April when icebergs drift further south. The ice warnings received that day clearly indicated a large ice field spanning about 80 miles directly across the shipping lane. Rather than slowing down or altering course to avoid this danger zone, the Titanic plowed straight ahead at nearly full speed. Why would Captain Smith take such a risk? The evidence points to pressure to maintain the schedule. The White Star Line was in fierce competition with Cunard and other shipping companies. While they hadn't advertised the Titanic as the fastest ship on the Atlantic, that honor belonged to Cunard's Mauritania, they were eager to demonstrate the ship's reliability and on-time performance during its maiden voyage. Captain Smith himself had a reputation for keeping to schedules. With 40 years of experience at sea, he had crossed the Atlantic hundreds of times. Perhaps this experience led to overconfidence. He had encountered ice fields before without incident, and might have believed the Titanic's size and strength made it immune to serious damage from icebergs. What Captain Smith may not have fully appreciated was how the physics of collision change with increased speed. The energy of impact doesn't increase in direct proportion to speed. It increases with the square of velocity. This means that doubling a ship's speed quadruples the energy of any collision. In practical terms, if the Titanic had been traveling at 10 knots instead of 22 knots, the impact force would have been less than 1/4 as powerful. At half speed, the collision would have generated only about 20% of the actual impact energy. This enormous difference in collision force directly affected how the ship's hull and rivets responded to the impact. The brittle, slag-filled rivets we discussed earlier might have survived a low-speed collision, but they had no chance against the massive forces generated at 22 knots. Scientists who've studied the wreckage estimate that the area of hull damage was approximately 12 square feet, surprisingly small for such a catastrophic outcome. But the force of the impact, combined with the brittle rivets, allowed water to enter the ship at an estimated rate of 7 tons per second. The third critical flaw in the Titanic's design now became apparent: the insufficient height of its watertight bulkheads. These dividers between compartments rose only a few feet above the waterline, complying with 1911 maritime regulations, but proving woefully inadequate in practice. As the bow began to sink, water simply spilled over the tops of these bulkheads into adjacent compartments, creating a domino effect of flooding. Modern ship safety protocols reflect the lessons learned from this disaster. Today, vessels are required to reduce speed in areas of known ice hazards. The International Ice Patrol, established after the Titanic disaster, monitors iceberg positions and provides warnings to ships. Modern captains who ignore such warnings and fail to reduce speed face severe professional consequences. The high speed not only increased the impact force, but also drastically reduced the time available for evasive action once the iceberg was spotted. At 22 knots, the Titanic was covering about 37 feet per second. Every second of reaction time was precious, and every second lost meant over 37 feet, less distance for turning or stopping. Maritime experts have calculated that if the Titanic had been traveling at 15 knots or less, the collision might have been avoided entirely. The lookouts would have spotted the iceberg at the same distance, but the ship would have had significantly more time to turn. Even if a collision still occurred, the reduced impact force might have limited the damage to 1 or 2 compartments rather than 6. The decision to maintain high speed through an ice field was a critical link in the chain of events leading to disaster. Without this excessive speed, the brittle rivets might never have been tested to their breaking point. The collision might have been avoided entirely, or the damage might have been limited to a manageable level. This excessive speed not only increased the damage, but also significantly reduced the crew's ability to avoid the iceberg once it was spotted. When the lookout finally saw the massive ice formation looming too fast to react, the crucial seconds between spotting the iceberg and impact reveal how the Titanic's excessive speed sealed its fate. When lookout Frederick Fleet spotted the iceberg, the Titanic was just 37 seconds from impact, but it didn't have to be that way. Those 37 seconds determined the fate of over 1,500 souls, and they were directly connected to the ship's speed. The night of April 14th, 1912 presented deceptively dangerous conditions for navigation. The sea was unusually calm, so calm that small waves weren't even breaking against the base of icebergs, which would have made them easier to spot. The sky was clear and filled with stars, but crucially, there was no moon. This created what sailors call a dark night bright horizon, a condition where icebergs are particularly difficult to see until you're dangerously close to them. In these tricky conditions, the lookouts needed every advantage they could get, but they were missing a crucial tool, binoculars. In a remarkable oversight, the officer who had the key to the binocular cabinet had been transferred off the ship shortly before its departure, and he forgot to hand the key to his replacement, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. The lookouts stationed in the crow's nest that night had to rely solely on their naked eyes to spot any hazards in their path. Let's walk through the timeline of those critical moments. At approximately 11:40 p.m., Fleet spotted something dark directly ahead of the ship. He immediately rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. "What did you see?" asked 6th Officer James Moody. "Iceberg, right ahead." Fleet replied urgently. First Officer Murdoch ordered hard a starboard, which in those days meant turning the ship to port or left, and telegraphed the engine room to stop, then reverse engines. The ship began to turn, but it was too late. Just 37 seconds after Fleet first spotted the iceberg, the Titanic's starboard side scraped against it, creating a series of gashes below the waterline. From first sighting to impact, just over half a minute. That's barely enough time to run the length of a football field. Why was this time frame so short? The answer lies in simple physics. At 22 knots, about 25 miles per hour, the Titanic was covering approximately 37 feet every second. The iceberg was spotted about a quarter of a mile ahead, roughly 1,320 feet. Divide distance by speed, and you get 35 to 37 seconds of reaction time. That's all the time the crew had to spot the danger, communicate it to the bridge, process the information, decide on a response, and execute the maneuver. Now imagine if the Titanic had been traveling at 10 knots instead of 22. At that reduced speed, the ship would have covered about 17 feet per second. Using the same detection distance, the crew would have had about 78 seconds to react, more than twice the actual time available. Those extra 41 seconds could have made all the difference. Even if we assume the iceberg would still have been spotted at the same distance, which is conservative since slower speeds allow more time to scan the horizon, the reduced velocity would have given the helmsman more time to turn the ship. The turning radius would have been smaller too, as a ship's turning circle is directly related to its speed. At 10 knots, the Titanic might have avoided the iceberg entirely. This wasn't some impossible expectation. Standard maritime practice at the time was to reduce speed or stop altogether when navigating through ice fields, especially at night. Captain Smith knew this. He had over 40 years of experience at sea and had navigated ice fields many times before. Other ships in the area, like the SS Californian, had stopped completely for the night after encountering ice. Maritime records from that era show that prudent captains routinely reduced speed to 5 to 10 knots in areas where ice had been reported. The captain of the SS Mesaba, which had warned the Titanic about the ice field just hours before the collision, had reduced his speed significantly. The captain of the SS Californian had chosen to stop entirely rather than navigate through ice in darkness. So, why didn't the Titanic slow down? The pressure to maintain the schedule and make a good impression on the maiden voyage likely played a role. There might also have been an element of overconfidence in the ship's size and strength. Whatever the reason, this decision cost precious seconds when they mattered most. Let's consider the turning distance. At 22 knots, once the order to turn was given, the Titanic needed approximately 900 feet to begin turning significantly. At 10 knots, that distance would have been reduced to about 400 feet. That's 500 feet of extra maneuvering room. More than enough to have avoided the iceberg entirely. The math is clear. At half speed, the crew would have had 78 seconds instead of 37 to react, and the ship would have needed less than half the distance to turn. Combined, these factors would have given the Titanic about 3 times better odds of avoiding the collision altogether. Those lost seconds weren't just about avoiding the iceberg. Even if a collision still occurred, a lower speed would have resulted in much less damage. Impact force increases with the square of velocity, so having the speed would have reduced the impact force to 1/4 of what actually occurred. The brittle rivets we discussed earlier might have held at this reduced force, limiting the flooding to perhaps 1 or 2 compartments instead of 6. What happened after impact revealed how quickly the situation deteriorated. As water poured into the damaged compartments, each flooded section increased the weight of the bow, causing it to sink deeper. This additional weight forced the bow down, allowing water to spill over the tops of the bulkheads into adjacent compartments. This cascading effect accelerated the flooding process, with each newly flooded compartment adding more weight and pulling the bow further down. The Titanic sank in just 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision. In the final moments, the stern section rose almost vertical before plunging into the North Atlantic at 2:20 a.m. The rapid final collapse shocked even the ship's designers, who had calculated a much longer floating time based on their understanding of the vessel's compartments. This unexpectedly quick sinking points to a fundamental problem with the ship's design. One that would turn what should have been a survivable accident into an unstoppable catastrophe. The Titanic was supposed to remain afloat even with multiple compartments flooded. So, why did it sink so quickly with damage to just 6 compartments? The fatal design flaw. The answer lies in a critical design compromise that doomed the ship from the moment of impact. The Titanic featured 16 watertight compartments, which was a major selling point for the ship's safety. These compartments were separated by massive walls called bulkheads. In theory, if the hull was breached, the crew could close watertight doors between compartments, containing the flooding to just the damaged areas. This system was so impressive that White Star Line executives confidently claimed the ship was practically unsinkable. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, had calculated that the Titanic could stay afloat with up to 4 of its forward compartments completely flooded. Based on this calculation, the ship should have survived even after the collision with the iceberg, which damaged 6 compartments. So, why did the unsinkable ship sink in just 2 hours and 40 minutes? The answer lies in the height of those watertight bulkheads. While these internal walls effectively separated the compartments horizontally, they didn't extend all the way up through the ship. Instead, they stopped just a few feet above the waterline. This meant that if water rose above the top of a bulkhead in one compartment, it would spill over into the next compartment like water flowing over a dam. You can picture it like ice cube trays. If you fill one section of an ice cube tray with water, the dividers keep the water in that section. But if you pour too much water into that section, eventually it will spill over the top of the divider into the next section. The Titanic's bulkheads worked exactly the same way. Why would the designers create such an obvious weakness? The answer involves a compromise between safety and luxury. If the bulkheads had extended all the way to the top of the ship, they would have cut through the luxurious public spaces on the upper decks. Imagine trying to enjoy a fancy dinner or dance in the grand ballroom with huge walls cutting through the middle of the room. The ship's designers chose to prioritize these open, luxurious spaces over complete watertight integrity. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was also about marketing. White Star Line was competing fiercely with other shipping companies for wealthy passengers. The grand public rooms were a major selling point. By limiting the height of the bulkheads, designers created impressive open spaces that wowed first-class passengers, but they also introduced a fatal weakness into the ship's safety systems. What's particularly interesting is that naval architects of the time understood this was a compromise. The concept of extending bulkheads all the way to the upper decks wasn't unknown. It just wasn't considered necessary given the other safety features of the ship. The designers believed that the chances of damage extensive enough to flood multiple compartments was so small that partial bulkheads would be sufficient. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, the damage allowed water to pour into the first 6 compartments. As these forward compartments filled with water, the ship's bow began to sink lower in the water. This created a domino effect. As the bow sank, water in the first damaged compartment rose until it reached the top of the bulkhead. Once water reached that point, it began spilling over into the next compartment. Now, the second compartment had water flowing in from 2 sources, through the damaged hull and over the top of the forward bulkhead. This caused the bow to sink even lower, which then allowed water to spill from the second compartment into the third, and so on. Each flooded compartment accelerated the flooding of the next one in line. This cascading flooding effect created an unstoppable chain reaction. No matter how hard the crew worked the pumps, they couldn't keep up with water flowing over the tops of the bulkheads. Once this process began, the Titanic's fate was sealed. What simple design change could have saved the ship? If the bulkheads had extended just a few decks higher, the water would have remained contained in the damaged compartments. The ship might have taken on a noticeable tilt, but it likely would have remained afloat until help arrived. This single design change could have saved over 1,500 lives. In fact, after the Titanic disaster, maritime regulations were changed to require higher bulkheads on passenger ships. Modern cruise ships now have bulkheads that extend much higher, often all the way to the main deck. This ensures that flooding in one area doesn't cascade into undamaged sections of the ship. The insufficient height of the watertight bulkheads was the third critical flaw that contributed to the Titanic disaster. Combined with the brittle rivets and excessive speed, it created the perfect storm of failures that sank the unsinkable ship. Modern engineering analysis has identified how each of these flaws could have been fixed, potentially changing the outcome. 1. Proper rivets with lower slag content could have confined damage to just 2 compartments, well within the ship's survivable limits. 2. Reducing speed to 10 knots in the ice field would have either allowed complete avoidance of the iceberg or limited the collision damage to a small, manageable breach. 3. Extending the bulkheads just 2 decks higher would have contained the flooding to the damaged compartments, keeping the ship afloat until rescue arrived. Instead, these 3 flaws worked together with devastating results. The high speed increased the force of impact, the brittle rivets failed catastrophically, and the low bulkheads allowed water to cascade from one compartment to another. This combination turned what should have been a manageable accident into one of history's deadliest maritime disasters. The domino effect. The 3 fatal flaws combined to create a perfect storm of failure. But the timeline of the sinking reveals how these design compromises turned a manageable accident into an unstoppable catastrophe. What happens when water can flow freely from one compartment to another? A slow-motion catastrophe that turned the unsinkable Titanic into a 52,000-ton coffin. When the iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the Titanic, it created a series of gashes and popped rivets that allowed water to pour into 6 of the forward compartments. The damage extended nearly 300 feet along the hull, almost a third of the ship's length. Imagine punching 6 holes in one end of a bathtub. That's essentially what happened to the Titanic. In the first minutes after the collision, the situation didn't seem particularly dire. Many passengers didn't even realize anything serious had happened. Some were awakened by the impact, which felt like a shudder or vibration rather than a violent crash. A few curious first-class passengers came out of their cabins to see what had happened, but most went back to bed. One passenger even continued playing cards. This false sense of security existed because the flooding wasn't immediately visible to most people on board. Meanwhile, below decks, the flooding began immediately. Water poured into the forward compartments at an estimated rate of 7 tons per second. The ship's pumps could only remove about 1.7 tons per second, so they were fighting a losing battle from the start. Within 10 minutes of the collision, water had already risen 14 feet in the forward compartments. As the water filled the first few compartments, the bow of the ship began to sink lower in the water. This created a domino effect that would seal the Titanic's fate. Remember those watertight bulkheads that didn't extend all the way up? As the bow sank, water in the first damaged compartment reached the top of the bulkhead and began spilling over into the next compartment behind it. Now, the second compartment had water coming in from 2 sources through the damaged hull and over the top of the forward bulkhead. This caused the bow to sink even faster, which then allowed water to spill from the second compartment into the third, and so on. Each flooded compartment accelerated the flooding of the next. The initial breach allowed water to flood into 6 of the Titanic's 16 watertight compartments. This damage initiated a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to the ship's demise. The flooding of these compartments wasn't just a static problem, it was dynamic, getting worse with each passing minute. The watertight compartments, while intended to prevent sinking, were only watertight horizontally. Their tops were open and the walls extended only a few feet above the waterline. This design flaw was a deliberate marketing choice to preserve the luxurious first-class spaces. Deck plans show that extending the bulkheads would have interrupted the grand staircase, the first-class dining saloon, and other opulent public areas that were key selling points for wealthy passengers. The compromise between safety and luxury proved fatal. Using modern fluid dynamics calculations, experts estimate that each of the damaged compartments filled at different rates. The first compartment, which took the brunt of the impact, filled almost completely within 20 minutes. The second compartment took about 30 minutes to fill. The third took 40 minutes, and so on. But as water began spilling over the tops of the bulkheads, these filling rates accelerated dramatically. By 12:30 a.m., about 50 minutes after the collision, the ship's bow was noticeably lower in the water. By 1 a.m., the forward well deck was awash, meaning water was now visible on the exterior of the ship. At this point, Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, knew the Titanic was doomed. Their calculations showed that too many compartments were flooding for the ship to remain afloat. As the bow continued to sink, the flooding accelerated. Water began pouring through anchor chain holes and other openings that were now underwater due to the ship's tilt. Every ton of water that entered increased the ship's weight and pushed it lower in the water, allowing even more water to enter. By 2 a.m., the situation had become critical. The bow was deeply submerged, and the ship's tilt had increased dramatically. As the bow compartments filled, the ship began to tilt down in the front and slightly to the right. Around this time, the propellers in the stern were lifted out of the water as the bow continued to submerge. This shift in weight and balance was a clear indication of the impending disaster. The increasing weight of water created a feedback loop that continuously accelerated the sinking process. Each additional ton of water not only added weight, but also changed the ship's center of gravity, causing it to tilt more, which allowed water to enter even faster through new openings. By 2:15 a.m., the strain on the ship became too great. The Titanic's structure began to fail as the weight of the water-filled bow pulled downward while the still buoyant stern rose higher. Witnesses reported hearing a loud crack as the ship broke apart between the third and fourth funnels. The forward section, filled with water and extremely heavy, sank quickly. The stern section, temporarily buoyant, rose to a nearly vertical position before also filling with water and sinking at approximately 2:20 a.m. This cascading flooding effect created an unstoppable chain reaction. Once water began spilling over the tops of the bulkheads, the Titanic's fate was sealed. No amount of pumping could have saved the ship at that point. The design that was meant to contain flooding instead facilitated it, allowing water to move freely from one compartment to another like water flowing downstairs. The economic decisions that led to these fatal flaws are equally revealing. Records from shipyards of the era show that steel rivets cost approximately 30% more than wrought iron ones. This cost difference, multiplied across the millions of rivets needed, represented a significant expense that White Star Line chose to avoid in many sections of the hull. Similarly, extending the bulkheads would have added construction costs while reducing profitable passenger space. Could the Titanic have survived if just one thing had been different? The evidence suggests some fascinating possibilities. What if? The alternate scenarios. Modern engineering analysis gives us a remarkable window into how history might have unfolded differently. Let's examine what might have happened if just one critical flaw had been fixed. Engineers and historians have developed detailed simulations to test different scenarios. By modeling the physics of the collision and the flooding that followed, they can determine how changing one variable might have altered the outcome. These aren't just guesses. They're based on rigorous analysis of the wreckage, survivor accounts, and modern understanding of materials science and naval architecture. Let's start with the rivets. What if the Titanic had been built with properly made rivets containing less slag? The National Institute of Standards and Technology found that the Titanic's rivets contained 3 times the allowable amount of slag, making them extremely brittle in cold water. This brittleness caused them to fail catastrophically upon impact. If stronger steel rivets had been used throughout the hull, the impact damage would have been significantly reduced. Modern simulations suggest that properly made rivets would have deformed rather than shattering, keeping most of the hull plates firmly connected. Instead of water pouring in through multiple gashes along 300 feet of hull, the damage might have been limited to just 1 or 2 compartments. With only 1 or 2 compartments flooded, the Titanic would have remained stable and afloat. The ship was designed to survive with up to 4 compartments flooded, so this reduced damage would have kept the vessel well within its safety margins. The ship might have limped to New York with some flooding, but all passengers would likely have survived. Now consider our second scenario. What if the Titanic had been traveling at half speed? At 10 to 12 knots instead of 22 knots, the physics of the collision would have been dramatically different. Since impact energy increases with the square of velocity, having the speed would have reduced the impact force to approximately 1/4 of what actually occurred. This reduced force would have caused much less damage to the hull, even with the brittle rivets. The lower speed would also have given the crew nearly twice as much time to react once the iceberg was spotted. Those extra seconds might have allowed for a complete miss or a much less damaging glancing blow. At half speed, even if a collision still occurred, the damage would likely have been limited to just 2 or 3 compartments. Again, this would have kept the flooding within the ship's design limits, allowing it to stay afloat until rescue arrived. The collision would have been a scary incident, but not a catastrophic disaster. For our third scenario, let's imagine the Titanic with higher, watertight bulkheads. If these internal walls had extended just 2 or 3 decks higher, they would have prevented the cascading flooding effect that ultimately doomed the ship. With higher bulkheads, water entering the damaged compartments would have remained contained, unable to spill over into adjacent areas. This would have slowed the sinking dramatically, potentially giving the ship enough time to stay afloat until rescue vessels arrived. The Carpathia, which picked up the survivors, arrived about 3 hours and 40 minutes after the collision. If the Titanic had sunk more slowly or remained partially afloat, many more lives could have been saved. Naval architects who've studied the disaster agree that any one of these changes could have prevented the catastrophe. Professor William Garsk of the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers has stated that the combination of all three flaws created a perfect storm of failures. Remove just one element from this deadly equation, and the outcome changes dramatically. The most surprising aspect of these scenarios is that none of them would have required advanced technology or knowledge unavailable in 1912. Higher quality rivets were being used in other ships. Reducing speed in ice fields was standard practice, and extending bulkheads higher was a known safety measure that had been implemented on other vessels. The Titanic disaster led to immediate and lasting changes in maritime safety regulations. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SALAS, adopted in 1914 and updated every decade since, established requirements for sufficient lifeboats, emergency equipment, and continuous radio communications. The Radio Act of 1912 mandated 24-hour radio watches on passenger ships, directly addressing the Californians' failure to respond to the Titanic's distress signals. These alternate scenarios highlight an important truth about disasters. They rarely have a single cause. Instead, they typically result from a chain of events and decisions, any one of which could have been changed to prevent catastrophe. The Titanic didn't sink because of an iceberg. It sank because of brittle rivets, excessive speed, and insufficient bulkhead height, combined with an iceberg. This raises an important question. If these flaws were so critical, why were they allowed to exist in the first place? What business decisions and priorities led to these compromises in safety? The answer reveals much about how economic cutting corners, the business decisions. Behind the glittering facade of the world's most luxurious ocean liner lay a series of business decisions that would prove catastrophic when tested against the harsh realities of the North Atlantic. Why would the world's most prestigious ship use substandard materials? The answer comes down to money. Behind the luxury and grandeur of the Titanic lay business decisions that prioritize profits over safety, creating the perfect conditions for disaster. The White Star Line faced enormous pressure when building the Titanic and her sister ships Olympic and Britannic. They were locked in fierce competition with Cunard Line, which had launched two impressive ships, the Lusitania and Mauretania, a few years earlier. These Cunard vessels were faster than anything White Star had, capable of crossing the Atlantic in under 5 days. Instead of competing on speed, White Star decided to focus on size and luxury. Their strategy was to build the largest, most luxurious ships ever seen, offering wealthy passengers unprecedented comfort. This strategic decision shaped everything about the Titanic, from its lavish first-class accommodations to its technical specifications. The construction of 3 enormous ships, Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, created significant financial strain on White Star Line and its parent company International Mercantile Marine. The total cost for these 3 vessels was approximately $7.5 million in 1912, about $190 million today. This massive investment created pressure to cut costs wherever possible without affecting the visible luxury that would attract wealthy passengers. One area where costs were cut was in the materials used for construction. White Star Line chose to use cheaper wrought iron rivets instead of stronger steel rivets in many parts of the hull, particularly in the bow and stern sections. Steel rivets cost about 30% more than iron rivets. While this might seem like a small difference, when multiplied by the millions of rivets needed, it represented significant savings. The company also faced manufacturing limitations. The shipyard in Belfast didn't have enough hydraulic riveting machines to install steel rivets throughout the entire hull. Installing steel rivets manually was difficult, so wrought iron rivets were used in areas where machines couldn't reach. These iron rivets contained excessive slag that made them brittle in cold water. This cost-cutting decision saved White Star Line thousands of dollars during construction, but created a critical weakness in the ship's hull, a weakness that would be exposed on that fateful night in April 1912. The pressure to maintain schedules also influenced operational decisions once the Titanic was at sea. White Star Line was eager to demonstrate that their new flagship could complete its maiden voyage on time. The shipping industry ran on reliability, and arriving on schedule was considered essential for building customer confidence. This schedule pressure helps explain why Captain Smith maintained high speed despite receiving multiple ice warnings. Slowing down would have delayed arrival in New York, potentially harming the ship's reputation for reliability. White Star management had cultivated a culture where captains understood that keeping to schedule was a priority. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star Line who was traveling on the Titanic, was reportedly interested in the ship's daily progress and speed. While no direct evidence shows he ordered Captain Smith to maintain high speed, his presence may have created implicit pressure to impress the boss with a timely crossing. The design compromises that limited the height of the watertight bulkheads were also driven by business considerations. Extending these bulkheads all the way up would have cut through the grand public rooms on the upper decks, making them less impressive. These luxurious spaces were key selling points for attracting wealthy first-class passengers who provided most of the profit. By limiting bulkhead height, White Star created more impressive public spaces, but compromised the ship's ability to contain flooding. This trade-off between safety and luxury reflected the company's business strategy of competing on comfort and opulence rather than technical superiority. When we compare the cost savings from these decisions to their ultimate cost, the contrast is stark. Using cheaper rivets might have saved $15,000 to $20,000 during construction. Maintaining speed saved perhaps a few hours of travel time. The lower bulkheads created more luxurious public spaces that might have attracted a few more wealthy passengers. These modest savings and advantages came at the cost of over 1,500 lives and the destruction of the company's flagship vessel. The Titanic disaster exemplifies what safety engineers now call the Swiss cheese model of accidents. Each safety compromise, brittle rivets, excessive speed, insufficient. Bulkheads created a hole in one layer of protection. When all these holes aligned on April 14, 1912, disaster struck. No single failure caused the tragedy. Rather, it was the combination of multiple compromised safety layers that allowed the catastrophe to occur. White Star Line never fully recovered from the disaster. The company faced massive insurance claims, lawsuits from victims' families, and severe reputational damage. By the 1930s, financial difficulties forced White Star to merge with its former rival Cunard. These business decisions directly contributed to each of the three fatal flaws we've identified. The choice of cheaper materials led to brittle rivets. The pressure to maintain schedules led to excessive speed in dangerous conditions. The desire to maximize luxury spaces led to insufficient bulkhead height. The public outrage following the disaster led to immediate action. In 1914, the International Ice Patrol was established, now operated by the U.S. Coast Guard, which monitors iceberg dangers in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. This organization continues its work today, tracking icebergs and warning ships of potential dangers, a direct legacy of the Titanic disaster that has prevented countless similar tragedies. The Titanic disaster wasn't just a technical failure or an unfortunate accident. It was the result of business decisions that consistently prioritized cost savings, schedule adherence, and luxury over safety. The tragedy sparked unprecedented public outcry and governmental response, forever changing how ships are built, equipped, and operated. The question remains, how exactly did this terrible tragedy transform ship safety forever? Legacy of change. The sinking of the Titanic sparked an unprecedented wave of safety reforms that continue to protect lives at sea today. Within days of the disaster, both the United States Senate and the British Board of Trade launched extensive investigations. These weren't just formalities. They were detailed inquiries that interviewed survivors, examined technical evidence, and scrutinized every decision made before and during that fateful night. The American inquiry alone questioned 82 witnesses and produced over 1,100 pages of testimony. The British investigation was equally thorough. with Lord Mersey examining the ship's design, construction, and operation in meticulous detail. These investigations uncovered the failures we've discussed, the brittle rivets, the excessive speed, and the insufficient bulkhead height. But they also identified other safety issues that needed immediate attention. The most obvious was the shocking shortage of lifeboats. The Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats with a total capacity of 1,178 people, far short of the 2,208 people on board. The findings from these investigations led directly to the creation of the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea SALAS in 1914. This wasn't just another set of guidelines, it was a landmark international agreement that established mandatory safety standards for all merchant ships. SALAS represented the first time that countries around the world came together to create universal maritime safety regulations. One of the most immediate changes was the requirement for ships to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. The regulations specified exactly how many davits, the mechanisms used to lower lifeboats, must be installed based on the ship's size. They even detailed what each lifeboat must contain: oars, sails, compasses, signaling devices, food, and water. Large ships were required to have at least 2 motorized lifeboats to help round up other lifeboats in an emergency. The Titanic disaster also revolutionized communication at sea. Remember how the SS Californian was just 10 miles away, but never received the Titanic's distress signals because their radio operator had gone to bed? The Radio Act of 1912 fixed this dangerous gap by mandating 24-hour radio operation on all passenger ships. This continuous radio watch ensured that no distress call would go unheard simply because someone was sleeping. Another major innovation was the creation of the International Ice Patrol in 1914. This organization, now operated by the U.S. Coast Guard, continuously monitors ice conditions in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. They track icebergs and ice fields, providing vital information to ships traveling these dangerous waters. This patrol has been scanning the North Atlantic for over a century, helping prevent countless potential collisions. Material testing standards also underwent significant improvements. The brittle rivets that failed on the Titanic highlighted the need for better quality control in shipbuilding. New regulations established stricter testing requirements for hull materials and fasteners. Metallurgical standards were created to ensure that ships were built with components that could withstand the stresses of ocean travel, including operation in freezing waters. Speed regulations in hazardous conditions became much stricter after the Titanic disaster. New rules required captains to reduce speed or alter course when ice was reported in the area. These regulations acknowledged that even the largest ships needed to proceed with caution in dangerous conditions. The old practice of maintaining schedule at all costs was officially abandoned in favor of safety. Modern ship designs incorporate critical lessons learned from the Titanic's bulkhead failures. The White Star Line immediately modified the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, by extending the double bottoms up the sides of the hull and raising the height of the watertight bulkheads. This prevented water from spilling over from one compartment to another. Today's passenger ships feature watertight compartments that extend much higher, often all the way to the main deck, eliminating the cascading flooding effect that doomed the Titanic. These changes have saved countless lives in the century since the disaster. Maritime historian John Maxstone Graham estimated that the safety measures implemented after the Titanic have prevented dozens of similar disasters and saved tens of thousands of lives. When the Italian cruise ship Costa Concordia ran aground in 2012, the improved lifeboat requirements and evacuation procedures helped rescue all but 32 of the 4,229 people on board, a stark contrast to the Titanic's 1,500 fatalities. The most important legacy of the Titanic may be how it changed our understanding of what causes disasters. Rather than viewing accidents as simple events with single causes, we now recognize that disasters typically result from chains of failures and decisions. This perspective, often called the Swiss cheese model, shows how catastrophes occur when holes in multiple safety layers align. The Challenger space shuttle disaster demonstrated this pattern when O-ring failures combined with management pressure and cold temperatures led to catastrophe. Similarly, the Fukushima nuclear accident resulted when tsunami protection, backup power systems, and emergency procedures all failed simultaneously. By understanding these patterns of cascading failures, we can build safer systems across all fields of technology. The analytical methods developed to understand the Titanic disaster now help us understand and prevent failures in aviation, space exploration, and other complex systems. The concept of multiple redundant safety systems, ensuring that no single failure can cause catastrophe, has become a cornerstone of modern engineering, partly due to the lessons of the Titanic. Yet despite all these advances in safety engineering, we continue to see disasters that follow eerily similar patterns to the Titanic. What is it about human nature and organizational behavior that makes us vulnerable to these recurring patterns of failure? Modern lessons from a century-old disaster. The recurring patterns of failure throughout history reveal important lessons for our modern world. When we examine major disasters across different industries, we see striking similarities to what happened on that cold April night in 1912. The Titanic disaster wasn't caused by a single iceberg. It was the result of multiple small failures combining in the worst possible way. This pattern of multiple failures leading to disaster isn't just a historical curiosity. It continues to appear in modern accidents across industries from oil rigs to airplanes. When we look at major disasters from recent decades, we see the same patterns that sank the Titanic. Take the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. This wasn't just about one faulty valve or a single poor decision. It involved a combination of equipment failures, poor risk management, and inadequate safety protocols. Each problem alone might have caused a minor incident. Together, they created one of the worst environmental disasters in history. Modern engineering still struggles with the same three issues that doomed the Titanic. First, material quality remains a constant challenge. Even with advanced testing methods, substandard materials sometimes make their way into critical components. Second, operational decisions continue to prioritize efficiency and schedules over safety in many industries. Third, design compromises are still made that trade safety margins for cost savings or other benefits. The Boeing 737 MAX crashes in 2018 and 2019 provide a perfect modern example. These tragic accidents resulted from multiple failures working together. There was a faulty flight control system called MCOS that could push the nose down unexpectedly. The pilots received insufficient training on how to respond to this system, and regulatory oversight wasn't strong enough to catch these problems before the planes entered service. No single factor caused these crashes. It was the combination that proved deadly. These patterns are so common that safety experts have developed a special way to understand them. It's called the Swiss cheese model, created by psychologist James Reason. Imagine a stack of Swiss cheese slices, each representing a safety system. The holes in each slice represent weaknesses in that system. Normally, the holes don't line up, so problems get caught by at least one layer. But sometimes by bad luck or bad design, all the holes align. When that happens, hazards can pass through every layer of protection, causing a disaster. No one thing sent the Titanic to the bottom of the North Atlantic, notes an article on the Titanic's rivets. Rather, the ship was ensnared by a perfect storm of circumstances that conspired her to doom. Such a chain is familiar to those who study disasters. It is called an event cascade. This perfectly describes how disasters typically unfold, not as single catastrophic failures, but as cascades of smaller problems that amplify each other. In the Titanic's case, the Swiss cheese model would show holes in material quality, the brittle rivets, operational decisions, excessive speed, and design features, insufficient bulkhead height. When these three holes aligned with the presence of an iceberg, disaster resulted. Understanding these patterns helps engineers and safety experts prevent future tragedies. By analyzing disasters like the Titanic, we can identify how seemingly unrelated weaknesses can combine in unexpected ways. This knowledge allows us to build redundant safety systems, multiple protective layers that catch problems even when one system fails. Modern risk management has evolved because of lessons from disasters like the Titanic. As one analysis states, modern organizations need a holistic, enterprise-wide view of their risks and how they interconnect. It's not enough to manage risks in silos. Businesses must understand how one risk can influence another. This approach recognizes that safety isn't about addressing individual hazards, but about understanding how different risks interact. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Titanic is that no single safety system is infallible. The ship's builders believed their watertight compartments made the vessel practically unsinkable. This overconfidence led them to overlook other potential weaknesses. Similarly, Boeing believed its flight control systems were foolproof, and BP thought its blowout preventers would never fail. These assumptions proved deadly in all three cases. What modern disasters share similar patterns of multiple system failures? Beyond the examples already mentioned, we could point to the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, O-ring failure, cold weather, management pressure, the Fukushima nuclear accident, tsunami, backup generator placement, regulatory oversight, and the collapse of the Morandi Bridge, in Italy, material degradation, inspection failures, design issues. In each case, it wasn't one big mistake, but several smaller problems that created disaster. The human element in technological disasters cannot be overlooked. In almost every major accident, human decisions play a crucial role. On the Titanic, Captain Smith decided to maintain speed despite ice warnings. In modern disasters, we often see similar decision-making errors, choosing speed over safety, profit over precaution, or convenience over caution. The Titanic shows that engineering thrives on attention to every detail, and even the smallest flaw can trigger catastrophe when combined with others. What small flaw might we be overlooking today? As we reflect on the true story of the Titanic, we see that it wasn't just about an iceberg. It was about how multiple factors came together in the worst possible way to create one of history's most famous disasters. The engineering failures that doomed the Titanic reveal a universal truth about disasters that extends far beyond this single maritime tragedy. Looking beyond the popular narrative, we now understand that three critical factors, brittle rivets, excessive speed, and inadequate bulkheads, combine to transform a manageable collision into history's most famous shipwreck. This perfect storm of failures reminds us that in complex systems, catastrophe rarely stems from a single cause. The true story of the Titanic isn't just about an iceberg in the North Atlantic. It's about human decisions made in boardrooms and on the bridge. It's about economic pressures, design compromises, and operational choices that prioritize schedules over safety. The legacy of the Titanic lives on in every safety regulation that protects travelers today, reminding us that attention to the smallest